Senator from North Dakota.
Mr. President, let me claim the 15 minutes, and would the would the President notify me when I've consumed 10 of the minutes? Mr. President, I came to the floor today with my colleague, Senator Reid from Nevada, to discuss a preliminary report that has been completed after some 2 years of work by the Government Accounting Office looking into the activities of the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve Board was created in 1913, and it's kind of a dinosaur in our government. In an age of openness, it is still an institution that is shrouded in great secrecy. But in 1913, the Congress created the Federal Reserve Board. That was the year in which Henry Ford built the first assembly line for the Model T and paid people $5 a day to work to construct automobiles a long time ago, 1913. But some things don't change very much. The Federal Reserve Board still exists. It still sits as a house on a hill with a large fence around it and invites no one to peer in to see what they are doing. They make a substantial amount of money. They make their own decisions about how much they need to spend, and they are accountable only to themselves. And we ask, Senator Reid and I, we ask the GAO to do an investigation or evaluation of how the Fed works. What does it spend its money on? How well does it spend its money? How accountable is it? And we have some 200-page report that represents the work of nearly 2 years by the GAO. This is not a final report. It's a preliminary report that is now awaiting comment by the Federal Reserve Board. The Senator from Nevada and I decided to release it now only because last week it was made available to us, and this week the Senate scheduled hearings on Chairman Greenspan's renomination. We felt that the Banking Committee at least ought to have the benefit of what is in this report prior to the hearings. Let me discuss a couple points in this report and then ask my colleague Senator Reid to discuss a couple of other points, because I think this will provide a substantial amount of information that the American public will be interested in. You talk about the Federal Reserve Board and people's eyes start glazing over, and there starts to develop a large fog around the subject, largely because it is a central bank accountable largely only to itself. It conducts monetary policy by itself and does so behind closed doors with great secrecy. Now, what did the GAO find? Well, a couple things. First of all, let me discuss the surplus account that exists at the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve Board has a surplus account of $3.7 billion. In fact, the surplus account has increased well over 70% in the last 6 years. They've increased their surplus, which they set aside for reserves and losses and so on. They've increased it by 70%, so they now have a cash stash of $3.7 billion in a surplus account. This account, presumably, is to cover their losses. Now, the Federal Reserve Board hasn't lost money in 79 years and isn't going to lose money. It's just not going to lose money. Last year, it had a $20 billion plus profit, had expenses of about $2 billion, and then turns the rest back to Treasury. But it keeps a small surplus. Small by their definition, large by my definition. I come from a town of only 300 people, but their billions mean something. We don't even know what billions mean, really. But we got $3.7 billion put away in a surplus account down at the Fed. Now, what does the GAO say about that? Well, the GAO talks about this surplus account by suggesting that the downward adjustment to the size of the surplus account, or perhaps its elimination, would result in an increase in federal budgetary receipts and so on and so forth. And then they point out that when they asked the GAO, when they asked the Federal Reserve Board why they had this and how they determined what they needed, they said it's arbitrary. There's really no judgment there, or no criteria by which they judge how much they need. They just squirrel away as much as they want. This is the taxpayers' money, $3.7 billion squirreled away in this concrete edifice downtown that houses the Fed. And the GAO recommends, I recommend, and we will introduce legislation to suggest this money be money that goes back to the American taxpayers, not stashed as a surplus in an institution that hasn't had a loss in 79 years and isn't going to have a loss in the next 79 years. There are other areas in this report that also describe the operation of the Federal Reserve Board. Federal Reserve Board largely conducts monetary policy. And while I disagree with its monetary policies these days, I don't think that the monetary policy ought to exist here in the well of the U.S. Congress. I think it ought to be separate and apart. But I don't agree with the Fed when it believes its mission in life is to be a set of human brake pads designed to slow down the American economy. They happen to believe the American economy shouldn't grow more than 2.5%. If it grows more than that, somehow we're going to produce more inflation, they think. They're dead wrong. In the global economy, inflation is going down, not up. Wages are going down, not up. So I think their monetary policy is wrong, and they're inhibiting growth in this country and slowing down the American economy. But that's not what the GAO looked at. The GAO evaluated the other functions of the Fed. What's it spend its money on? You know, less than 10% of the activities of the Federal Reserve Board are spent on its monetary policy activities. The rest of it is bank supervision, check clearing, and a whole range of other things. Well, the Fed has counseled this country to cut its expenditures, slim down, downsize, streamline. Well, what has the Fed done? The Fed has counseled that America go on a diet, and it's decided to overeat. Here you have a circumstance where this shows what's happened between 1988 and 1994, according to the GAO. Personnel compensation up 53%. Benefits, that is, benefits per employee, increased 90% during the same period. Equipment, software up, buildings up. In fact, they built one building, and they estimated when they decided to build the building, they would need a 7,000 square foot lobby. That's a pretty good sized lobby. Well, when they finished the building, they had a 27,000 square foot lobby. You ought to see a picture of this lobby with no chairs. 27,000 square foot. And that also is in the GAO report. But if you take a look at the expenditures of the Fed, you'll see this line, which is the blue line, 1988 to 1994. The Fed, who writes its own checks and decides how much it wants to spend, nobody's suggesting that it ought to do this or ought not to do this. It decides how much of its money it wants to keep. 48% increase in expenditures between 1988 and 1994, according to the GAO. Consumer Price Index increased 25% during the same period. Almost double the Consumer Price Index in terms of the increase in cost down at the Fed. And I just indicated a couple of those items, but the cost per employee of the increases in benefits, employee benefits at the Fed, increased 90% during the 6-year term. So again, the suggestion by the Fed that the rest of the government tighten its belt is apparently advice lost on the Fed itself. And if you take a look at a whole range of these issues, the amount of money spent on personnel, on buildings, on benefits, a whole series of issues like that, what you'll find is a Federal Reserve Board that has not had a previous audit, but a board in which an audit would discover that it seems to be growing while the rest of the government is shrinking. And maybe we ought to bring the Federal Reserve Board into the same realm. I'm not talking about bringing monetary policy functions into this realm, but maybe the non-monetary policy functions of the Federal Reserve Board ought to be subject to annual appropriations, just as are all of the other functions of government. Certainly we ought to now proceed, based on what we will find in this report, to decide there should be every year, each and every year, an independent audit of the Federal Reserve Board. We ought to, based on what we've discovered in this report, decide that we should have this $3.7 billion taken out of the reserve account that's been squirreled away by the Fed itself and brought back into the stream of income that's available to the American taxpayers. Those are the things that we ought to do together. And there are a whole series of recommendations that Senator Reid and I will jointly employ in the decision on future legislation as a result of this GAO report. But let me conclude my portion of this where I began. The Federal Reserve Board is a dinosaur. In the rest of the government, we're now discussing openness. In the Federal Reserve Board, we still have the shroud of secrecy. In the rest of the government, we have the requirement for financial accountability. At the Federal Reserve Board, it's we will spend what we need to spend, and we'll make that judgment. While the rest of the federal government is shrinking with fewer employees, fewer now than any time during the government's history of going back to John F. Kennedy, the Federal Reserve Board is growing. That's why I think this GAO audit suggests that it is out of step and does need some correction. Mr. President, let me yield the floor, and my colleague, Senator Reid from Nevada, will discuss some of the other results of this GAO evaluation. Mr. President, how much time do I have remaining?
Senator from North Dakota has 4.5 minutes remaining.
And the senator from Nevada,
Has
Mr. President.
2.5 minutes remaining.
Mr. President, let me use a couple of these minutes by trying to put this in perspective. There is the policy issue with respect to the Federal Reserve Board, how it behaves, what it does, how it impacts this country's economy. And then there is the issue that we raise with respect to the GAO evaluation of the Fed, and that's what we're discussing before the Senate today. This 200-page evaluation of the Federal Reserve Board and its operations is the most significant look inside the Fed in 70, 80 years. And what it shows, as we've indicated, is they have stashed away $3.7 billion for a surplus, despite the fact they have never had a loss in 79 years. They are spending more and more during times when others in the federal government are being told they ought to tighten their belt. Those issues are issues that Congress ought to deal with. The Federal Reserve Board ought to be subject to an annual independent audit. We ought to have information and knowledge about what is going on behind that fence. And that's the reason that we want to make sure that our colleagues, the relevant committees, and others will be able to evaluate the wealth of information that exists in this draft report. Let me finally say a word about the policies of the Federal Reserve Board itself, which are different, separate and apart from the issues we've been discussing. I have very serious reservations about the monetary policies pursued by the Fed. As I've indicated, the Federal Reserve Board has seemed to feel now for some long while that this country cannot have economic growth rates above 2.5%. If they fancy themselves as a set of brake pads whose mission it is in life to slow down the American economy, I say they've succeeded. Give them a trophy. But that's not what this country needs. The global economy means that wages are falling, not rising. It means that inflation is going down, not up. And it means that this country can have a higher rate of growth. There are Democrats and Republicans who believe very strongly that a 2.5% growth rate for our economy is anemic and cannot provide the kind of opportunity and expansion that we need in this country. And I would hope, in addition to the discussion we will have about what the Fed is doing, how it runs its operations, how it spends its money, in addition to that, and we should have that discussion as a result of this report, I hope we will also have a discussion about the Fed's monetary policies and whether they are appropriate to try to produce the kind of economic future that we want in this country. In my judgment, they are not. 2 years ago, we saw the Federal Reserve Board increase interest rates 7 times. Why? Because they were heading off the fires of inflation, they suggested. But inflation wasn't going up, inflation was going down, and it continues to go down. What they managed to do with those interest rate increases was to slow down the American economy. That's not such a significant talent, and my Uncle Joe could slow down the American economy. Just bring Uncle Joe to town, I'm sure he could figure out how to throw a wrench in the crankcase. So it doesn't require peculiar skill to decide how to slow down the American economy. The question is, how do we get this economy moving again with healthy, robust economic growth that creates new jobs and new opportunities for all Americans without raising the specter of additional inflation? That's the task for all of us. The Federal Reserve Board sees itself on a singular mission: keep economic growth somewhere in the range of 2.5%. That is not enough growth for this country. No one ought to be satisfied with that. It doesn't produce the jobs or the opportunities this country needs. And, Mr. President, I hope that even as we discuss the report about what the Fed does and how it spends its money, we will also alternatively discuss Fed policies, especially in the area of monetary policy. Mr. President, I yield the floor.